Emily Johnson, a bright 13-year-old, looked forward to a special dinner with her adoptive parents, Laura and Michael. The day had started with sunshine, and the excitement of the celebration was palpable. Emily had just received excellent grades and made her school's debate team, achievements that her parents wanted to celebrate. Laura, her mother, had reserved a table at a prestigious restaurant downtown, something Emily had never experienced before. As the family entered the elegant space, Emily's eyes widened. The glass walls of the restaurant sparkled in the sunlight, and the white tablecloths, shiny cutlery, and floral arrangements created an air of luxury. Emily felt a sense of wonder and pride. This dinner was about her accomplishments. She was about to sit down at the table, feeling as though the world was hers. "Are you excited, Emily?" Laura asked, smiling warmly as they settled in. "This place is amazing," she continued, looking around with as much awe as her daughter. "I've never been to such a fancy place," Emily replied, her voice tinged with disbelief. "It feels like a dream." Michael, Emily's father, chuckled, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You've earned it, sweetheart. We're proud of you." As they laughed and joked about their food choices, Emily opting for the pesto spaghetti, there was a lightness in the air. The family felt united, basking in each other's love and joy. Little did they know that the celebration would take an unexpected turn. Midway through the meal, Emily noticed something unsettling. A few restaurant patrons seemed to be staring at her. At first, she dismissed it, thinking she might be imagining things. But the stares grew more frequent, and the quiet whispers among the restaurant staff made her uneasy. She glanced at her parents, wondering if they noticed anything strange. Before Emily could ask, the door of the restaurant opened, and two police officers entered. They stood tall in their pristine uniforms, scanning the room. Emily felt a knot form in her stomach as the officers began walking towards their table. She wanted to believe it was a coincidence, but the closer they got, the more her heart raced. "Ladies and gentlemen," one of the officers said in a firm voice, addressing the restaurant as a whole, "we are investigating a report and need to speak with the young girl here." Emily froze. The officer's eyes were fixed on her, and she could feel everyone in the restaurant watching. Her parents, stunned, looked at each other before Michael stood up. "What's going on?" he asked, his tone protective but composed. "Emily hasn't done anything wrong." The officer, maintaining his authoritative stance, replied, "We received a report about an incident involving a young girl matching her description." The accusation, though vague, was enough to send shockwaves through Emily's body. She had done nothing wrong. Why were they targeting her? Tension escalated as Laura, her voice trembling with indignation, stood up as well. "You can't just come in here and accuse our daughter without explaining yourselves." The second officer, more impassive, directed his gaze at Emily. "We need to ask her some questions. It's just protocol." Emily's heart was pounding in her chest. She felt every gaze in the restaurant on her, as if the entire room had turned against her. She wanted to speak up, to tell the officers they had made a mistake, but her voice seemed to vanish. The humiliation was overwhelming, and the sense of injustice weighed heavily on her young mind. Michael's voice grew louder, filled with anger. "This is an abuse of power. Emily is not a criminal. She's a child." Despite his protests, the officers stood their ground. The surrounding restaurant patrons, though silent, were visibly uncomfortable. Whispers grew louder, and Emily could feel the atmosphere shift from celebratory to oppressive. The officer's firm stance left no room for further argument. The pressure was mounting, and Emily felt as if the entire world was watching her. Her joy had been replaced by fear, confusion, and a rising sense of shame. What had started as a celebration had now turned into a nightmare. Laura, realizing the futility of the situation, grabbed Emily's hand. "We're leaving," she declared, her voice resolute despite the fear in her eyes. As the family moved to leave the restaurant, one of the officers muttered, "We'll be keeping an eye on you." Those words lingered in Emily's mind like a dark cloud as they exited the restaurant. The joy of the afternoon had evaporated, leaving behind a heavy, suffocating silence. Once in the car, Emily sat in the back seat, staring out the window at the passing trees, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She could still feel the weight of everyone's gaze, the humiliation pressing down on her. Laura and Michael exchanged worried glances, unsure of how to comfort their daughter. The atmosphere in the car was thick with unspoken emotion. The sunlight that had brightened their day now seemed distant and cold, as if it had retreated behind the dark clouds of prejudice and misunderstanding. "Emily," Laura began, her voice soft but steady, "we love you, sweetheart. None of what happened today was your fault." Emily, her eyes brimming with tears, barely nodded. The officers had treated her like a criminal, and the shame of that moment was etched into her memory. Why had they singled her out? What had she done to deserve such treatment? Michael spoke next, his voice filled with determination. "We're going to make sure this doesn't go unanswered. What happened today was wrong, and we're going to fight it." Emily wanted to believe her parents, but the fear and confusion still gnawed at her. Could things really change? Or would she always be seen as a threat just because of who she was? The next day, Emily returned to school, but things felt different. The previous night's events at the restaurant still played in her mind, casting a long shadow over her. As she walked through the school hallways, she could feel the stares of her classmates. Whispers followed her wherever she went, as if everyone knew what had happened. Emily tried to focus on her classes, but the weight of humiliation was too heavy to ignore. Her closest friend Hannah approached her during lunch. "Hey, are you okay?" she asked, concern filling her voice. Emily shrugged, not wanting to relive the experience. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice betraying the truth. But Hannah wasn't convinced. "I heard about what happened at the restaurant. That's awful. I can't believe they treated you like that." Emily felt a lump form in her throat. She had tried so hard to forget it, to push it down, but now it felt like it was consuming her again. "It was horrible. I didn't even do anything wrong, but they acted like I was guilty of something. I don't understand why." Hannah placed a hand on her shoulder. "People can be terrible, but you're not alone. I'm here for you, okay?" Despite her friend's comforting words, Emily still felt isolated. She couldn't shake the feeling that no matter what she did, people would always see her differently. Even at school, where she had once felt safe, she now felt like an outsider. At home, things weren't much better. Emily's parents, Laura and Michael, were still fuming over the incident. Laura had spent the entire day on the phone, trying to contact lawyers and civil rights organizations. She wanted answers, but more than that, she wanted justice for her daughter. That evening, as the family sat down for dinner, the tension in the room was palpable. Laura sighed, putting her fork down. "Emily, we're not going to let this go. We've contacted a lawyer, and we're going to file a formal complaint against the police department." Emily looked up from her plate, surprised. "What good will that do?" she asked, her voice tinged with bitterness. "They're not going to listen to us." Michael leaned forward, his expression serious. "We have to try, Emily. What happened to you wasn't right, and we can't just ignore it. If we don't stand up for you, who will?" Emily wanted to believe her parents, but doubt still gnawed at her. What if they don't care? What if nothing changes? Laura's eyes softened, and she reached out to take Emily's hand. "It's not just about you, sweetheart. There are so many others who have been treated unfairly. If we speak up, maybe we can make a difference for them too." Emily nodded, though she still wasn't convinced. The idea of fighting back was daunting. She didn't want to relive the trauma, to be the center of attention again. But deep down, she knew her parents were right. If they didn't stand up, who would? As the days passed, word of the restaurant incident began to spread through the community. Emily's parents started organizing meetings with local activists and civil rights advocates. They wanted to bring attention to the injustice their daughter had faced and push for change in the town's policing practices. Emily, however, was hesitant to get involved. The idea of speaking in front of people, of sharing her story, filled her with anxiety. What if no one believed her? What if they thought she was overreacting? One evening, Laura and Michael invited a local community organizer, Ms. Adams, to their home. Ms. Adams had been involved in social justice work for years and was eager to help the family with their cause. "Emily, I know this is difficult," Ms. Adams said gently as they sat around the living room, "but your voice is powerful. If you're willing to share your experience, it could inspire others to speak out too." Emily stared at the floor, unsure of what to say. She still felt so small, so powerless. "I don't know if I can do it," she admitted quietly. "I don't want to relive what happened." Ms. Adams nodded sympathetically. "I understand, but you don't have to do this alone. Your parents are here, and so is your community. We're all behind you, and by speaking out, you can help prevent this from happening to someone else." Emily remained silent for a moment, thinking about all the kids like her who might be going through the same thing. Maybe her story could make a difference. "I'll think about it," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. After days of contemplation, Emily finally made her decision. It was a quiet Saturday afternoon, and she sat in her room, staring out the window. The memory of the restaurant still haunted her, but she couldn't ignore the growing desire inside her to take action. She thought about all the times she had been treated differently because of her appearance, about the whispers and stares she had endured throughout her life. Maybe speaking out could change that. Not just for her, but for others too. Taking a deep breath, she walked downstairs where her parents were sitting at the kitchen table, going over some paperwork. "Mom, Dad," she said, her voice steady. "I've decided. I want to speak at the community meeting." Laura looked up, her eyes wide with surprise and pride. "Are you sure, honey? You don't have to do this if you're not ready." Emily nodded. "I'm sure. I need to do this. I can't just stay quiet anymore." Michael smiled, his eyes glistening with emotion. "We're so proud of you, Emily. Whatever happens, we'll be right by your side." The night of the community meeting arrived, and Emily found herself standing in front of a packed room. The local community center was filled with people, neighbors, friends, and even strangers who had heard about her story. The air was thick with anticipation, and Emily's heart raced as she looked out at the sea of faces. Her parents stood beside her, offering silent support. Ms. Adams had helped organize the meeting, and she was at the front, preparing to introduce Emily. Taking a deep breath, Emily stepped forward to the microphone. Her hands were shaking and her throat felt dry, but she knew she had to do this. "Hi," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "My name is Emily Johnson, and I want to tell you about something that happened to me recently." She recounted the events of that day at the restaurant, the joy of the celebration, the confusion when the police arrived, and the humiliation she felt as they treated her like a criminal. As she spoke, her voice grew stronger, fueled by the emotions she had kept inside for so long. "I didn't do anything wrong," she said, her voice steady now. "But they treated me like I was guilty just because of how I look. That's not fair, and it's not right." The room was silent as Emily finished her story. She could see the sympathetic faces of the audience, and for the first time in days, she felt like she wasn't alone. "I don't want anyone else to go through what I went through," she continued. "We need to change the way people are treated in this town, and we need to make sure everyone is treated with respect, no matter what they look like." As she stepped back from the microphone, the room erupted in applause. Emily felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had spoken her truth, and people were listening. As the applause from the community meeting died down, Emily felt a strange mix of relief and exhaustion. Her parents, Laura and Michael, were beaming with pride, but Emily's mind was still racing. She had done it. She had spoken out. But now what? The weight of the experience hadn't fully lifted, and she wasn't sure what would come next. The meeting had been a success in many ways. People had rallied behind Emily's story, offering their support and pledging to stand up against the injustice she had faced. But as the night wore on, Emily couldn't help but wonder if things would really change. At home, her parents tried to reassure her. "That was amazing, Emily," Laura said, hugging her tightly as they sat on the couch. "You were so brave." Michael nodded in agreement. "You've already made a difference. People are talking, and they're paying attention. This is just the beginning." Emily smiled weakly, but inside she was filled with doubt. Could her voice really make an impact? Would things really change? Or would the world remain just as unfair as it had always been? Later that night, as Emily lay in bed, her mind replayed the events of the past few weeks. The humiliation at the restaurant, the fear of speaking out, and the unexpected support from her community. All of it swirled together in her thoughts. She knew she had taken the first step, but what came next? Was she ready for the road ahead? The days following the community meeting brought a whirlwind of activity. News of Emily's story spread quickly, and soon local news stations were reaching out to her parents for interviews. Emily's story had struck a chord with people in her town, and now, more than ever, there was a growing call for change. The police department, however, remained silent. No official apology had been made, and that silence weighed heavily on Emily. Despite the support she had received, the lack of accountability from those who had wronged her left her feeling unsettled. At school, Emily's classmates treated her differently. Some offered words of encouragement, while others kept their distance. Even the teachers seemed unsure of how to approach her, as if she had suddenly become someone they didn't know how to talk to. Hannah, her closest friend, remained by her side. "You've started something big, Em," she said one afternoon as they sat in the school courtyard. "People are really paying attention. But how are you feeling?" "I don't know," Emily admitted. "It's weird. I'm glad people are listening, but I don't feel like things are really changing. The police haven't even apologized." Hannah nodded thoughtfully. "It's going to take time, but you've already made more of a difference than you think. You've got people talking, and that's the first step." Emily sighed, knowing her friend was right, but still the lingering feeling of injustice gnawed at her. She had told her story, but she wanted real change, something more than just words. As Emily's story continued to gain attention, not everyone was supportive. On social media, some people began to criticize her, accusing her of exaggerating the incident at the restaurant. They claimed she was trying to make a big deal out of nothing, and that the police had just been doing their job. The online attacks hurt, even though Emily tried to brush them off. She had expected some pushback, but the harsh words still stung. It was one thing to face the injustice in person, but seeing strangers criticize her online felt like a whole new level of pain. One day after school, Emily sat at the kitchen table with her parents, scrolling through the negative comments on her phone. "Why are people so mean?" she asked, her voice cracking with frustration. Laura put a hand on her shoulder. "People are afraid of change, Emily. When someone challenges the way things are, there will always be those who push back, but you can't let them silence you." Michael, sitting across from them, added, "You've come this far, Emily. Don't let the negative voices stop you. There are so many people who believe in you and what you're doing." Emily nodded, trying to take comfort in her parents' words, but the doubt still lingered. She wasn't sure if she had the strength to keep going. The pressure of being in the spotlight was overwhelming, and the weight of the responsibility felt too heavy for her young shoulders. Just when Emily was starting to feel like giving up, something unexpected happened. One afternoon, as she was walking home from school, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from the police department. She stopped in her tracks, her heart pounding as she read the message. The police chief had requested a meeting with her and her family. They wanted to discuss the incident at the restaurant, and more importantly, offer an official apology. Emily couldn't believe it. After weeks of silence, the police were finally acknowledging what had happened. She rushed home to tell her parents, who were equally surprised. The meeting was scheduled for the following week, and in the days leading up to it, Emily's emotions were all over the place. Part of her was hopeful that this could be the beginning of real change, but another part of her was wary. What if the apology wasn't sincere? What if it was just a way to quiet the growing outrage without actually addressing the deeper issues? When the day of the meeting arrived, Emily and her parents walked into the police station with a mix of hope and caution. The chief of police greeted them in a private room, his expression serious. "I want to start by apologizing," he said, his voice measured. "What happened to you, Emily, was wrong. Our officers acted inappropriately, and for that, I am truly sorry." The words were unexpected, and for a moment, Emily wasn't sure how to react. She had imagined this moment so many times in her head, but now that it was happening, it felt surreal. The chief continued, explaining that the department was working on new training programs to prevent incidents like this from happening again. He acknowledged the pain that Emily had experienced and assured her that changes were being made. As the meeting came to an end, Emily felt a small sense of relief. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was a step in the right direction. For the first time since the incident, she felt like her voice had been heard by the people in power. Following the meeting with the police chief, Emily's family received more support than ever. The community was energized by the apology, and it seemed like real progress was being made. Emily's parents organized another community meeting, this time with local officials and activists, to discuss how they could work together to create lasting change. At the meeting, Emily once again stood before a room full of people. This time, though, she felt different. The fear that had gripped her during the first meeting was gone, replaced by a sense of determination and purpose. "I never wanted to be in this position," she began, her voice steady. "But I've learned that sometimes we don't get to choose how we make a difference. What happened to me shouldn't happen to anyone else, and we all have a responsibility to make sure it doesn't." The room was silent as she spoke, but this time, the silence didn't feel heavy or oppressive. It felt like people were really listening, really understanding the importance of what she was saying. As the night went on, people shared their own stories of discrimination and injustice, and together they began to form a plan. They would create a task force to work with the police department, pushing for reforms and holding officers accountable. They would organize town hall meetings and protests to keep the pressure on. Emily felt a surge of hope. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was part of something bigger, something that could really make a difference. In the weeks that followed, Emily became more involved in the movement for change. She attended meetings, spoke at rallies, and even gave interviews to local news stations. The fear and doubt that had once held her back were now replaced by a sense of purpose and strength. But even as the movement gained momentum, there were still challenges. Some people in the community resisted the changes, arguing that the police didn't need to be reformed. Others questioned whether a 13-year-old girl should be at the forefront of such a serious issue. Emily knew it wouldn't be easy, but she also knew she couldn't stop now. She had come too far, and there was still so much work to be done. One evening, as she sat with her parents, reflecting on everything that had happened, Laura put her arm around her daughter. "You've done something incredible, Emily," she said softly. "You've shown people that they don't have to stay silent. You've given them hope." Emily smiled, feeling the warmth of her mother's words. "I couldn't have done it without you and Dad. We're in this together." Michael nodded. "And together, we're going to keep fighting." The road ahead was long, and the fight for justice was far from over. But Emily knew one thing for certain. She wasn't alone. With her family and community by her side, she had the strength to keep standing tall. As Emily continued her journey toward justice, the movement she had become a part of grew stronger. The apology from the police chief had ignited a spark in the community, but it was clear that it wasn't enough. People wanted more than just words. They wanted action. Emily's family, along with community leaders and activists, organized larger rallies. They worked on petitions demanding police reforms, including better training on racial bias, greater accountability for officers, and the creation of a community oversight board. Emily often found herself speaking at these events, her voice growing more confident with each passing day. The media continued to cover Emily's story, and soon her voice reached beyond her town. News outlets from nearby cities began reporting on the movement, framing it as a grassroots push for justice led by a courageous 13-year-old girl. Despite the growing support, there was also pushback. Some local officials and members of the police force were resistant to the idea of reform. They argued that the system was already fair and that changes were unnecessary. This opposition only fueled the determination of Emily and her community. At a rally in the town square, Emily stood before a crowd larger than she had ever seen. People held signs that read, "Justice for Emily" and "End racial bias in policing." The energy was electric, and as Emily took the microphone, she felt the weight of the moment. "This fight is bigger than just me," she began, her voice carrying over the crowd. "It's about all of us, everyone who has ever felt like they were judged because of the way they look. We deserve to feel safe in our own community, and we're not going to stop until that happens." The crowd erupted in applause, and for the first time, Emily felt the full power of her voice. She was no longer just a scared girl. She was a leader in a movement for change. However, the path to justice wasn't easy. Despite the overwhelming support from the community, the local government was slow to act. The police department, while offering verbal apologies, resisted implementing the reforms that were being demanded. Frustration began to build among the activists, and Emily could feel the tension in the air. At one town hall meeting, where community members gathered to hear from local officials, the mood was particularly charged. Emily sat with her parents, listening as the mayor gave a speech that seemed more focused on maintaining the status quo than on addressing the real issues. "We appreciate the concerns that have been raised," the mayor said, his tone cautious. "But we believe our police force is already doing a fine job. While we are open to discussions, we don't believe drastic changes are necessary." The words stung, and Emily could sense the disappointment rippling through the crowd. People murmured in frustration, and some even booed. Emily's heart sank as she realized that, despite all their efforts, The people in power weren't taking them seriously. After the meeting, Emily and her parents stood with a group of supporters outside the town hall. Ms. Adams, the community organizer, was visibly upset. "We can't let them get away with this," she said, her voice firm. "We need to keep pushing. They won't act unless we make them." Emily felt a surge of determination. The setbacks only made her more resolved to continue the fight. "We won't stop," she said, her voice steady. "They're going to have to listen to us." As the movement pressed on, the strain began to take a toll on Emily. Balancing school, activism, and the pressure of being in the public eye was overwhelming. She often found herself lying awake at night, wondering if things would ever change. Her grades began to slip, and her once close friendships started to fray. Hannah, who had been supportive throughout, noticed the changes in Emily and tried to reach out. "Hey, you've been really quiet lately," she said one afternoon at school. "Are you okay?" "I'm just tired," Emily admitted, rubbing her eyes. "It feels like there's so much to do, and I don't know if I can keep up." Hannah gave her a sympathetic smile. "You don't have to do everything by yourself. You've already done so much. Maybe it's okay to take a break." But Emily shook her head. "I can't stop now. If I do, it'll feel like I'm giving up." At home, things weren't much easier. Laura and Michael, while proud of their daughter, could see that the fight was wearing her down. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, Laura sat down with Emily in the living room. "I know this is hard on you," Laura said gently. "You've taken on so much, and it's okay to feel overwhelmed." Emily looked at her mother, tears welling up in her eyes. "I just don't know if I'm strong enough to keep going," she whispered. Laura pulled her into a hug. "You are strong enough, Emily. But remember, you're not in this alone. We're all here with you, and you don't have to carry the weight of this fight by yourself." Emily nodded, feeling a small sense of relief. It was true, she wasn't alone. She had her family, her friends, and her community. Together they could carry the fight forward. After weeks of setbacks, a breakthrough finally came. The local government, feeling the growing pressure from the community and the media, agreed to a series of meetings with activists to discuss the proposed reforms. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was a step in the right direction. Emily and her family, along with Ms. Adams and other community leaders, attended the first meeting at City Hall. The atmosphere was tense, but there was a sense of cautious optimism in the air. As the meeting began, the police chief, the mayor, and other officials listened to the demands for change. Emily, sitting next to her parents, felt a nervous energy coursing through her. She had spoken out before, but this felt different. This time, she was sitting across from the people who had the power to make real change. When it was her turn to speak, Emily took a deep breath and addressed the room. "What happened to me wasn't just a mistake," she said, her voice steady. "It was part of a bigger problem that affects a lot of people in our community. We need to fix that." The officials listened intently, and as the meeting continued, it became clear that they were starting to take the movement seriously. The discussions were long and often contentious, but by the end of the day, there was a sense of progress. The police department agreed to implement new training programs on racial bias, and the city committed to creating a community oversight board. It wasn't everything they had hoped for, but it was a start. As Emily and her family left the meeting, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. For the first time in weeks, she felt like real change was within reach. Despite the small victories they had achieved, Emily and the community knew there was still much to be done. The reforms agreed upon by the local government were a start, but they weren't enough to truly address the systemic issues of racial bias and police accountability. The fight needed one last push to ensure the changes would be fully implemented and sustained. Emily found herself busier than ever, attending meetings, speaking at rallies, and helping to organize protests. The community was energized, but the constant pressure was taking a toll on her. She had barely any time for schoolwork, and her once close friendships were starting to feel distant. Even her parents noticed the strain. One evening, after a particularly long day, Emily sat down with her parents at the dinner table. The exhaustion in her eyes was unmistakable, and Laura and Michael exchanged concerned glances. "Emily, we're so proud of everything you've done," Michael said gently. "But you've been carrying so much. Maybe it's time to let others take the lead for a while." Emily shook her head, her determination clear. "I can't stop now. We're so close to making real change." Laura leaned forward, her voice soft but firm. You don't have to do everything by yourself, sweetheart. You've already done so much, more than most people ever do in a lifetime. It's okay to let others help." Emily sighed, feeling the weight of her parents' words. They were right. She didn't have to do it all on her own. But even as she acknowledged that, she knew she couldn't walk away from the fight just yet. The day of the public hearing arrived, a critical moment where the city council would vote on whether to fully adopt the proposed police reforms. The atmosphere in the town was electric, with both supporters and opponents of the reforms gathering outside City Hall. The tension was palpable, and Emily could feel it in her bones. Inside the packed auditorium, Emily sat with her parents and Ms. Adams, waiting for the hearing to begin. She had been asked to speak again, and this time, the stakes felt even higher. The reforms would only pass if there was enough public pressure, and Emily knew her voice would be a key part of that effort. As the hearing began, local officials made their opening statements. Some were in favor of the reforms, while others expressed skepticism, arguing that the changes were too drastic. The back-and-forth debate between council members was tense, and the room buzzed with anticipation. Finally, it was Emily's turn to speak. She stood up and walked to the podium, her heart racing. The crowd quieted, and all eyes turned to her. "I've told my story before," Emily began, her voice clear and strong. "But I'm not here today just to talk about what happened to me. I'm here to talk about what's happening to all of us. We live in a town where people are judged by the color of their skin, where the police act on bias instead of facts. That needs to change." The room was silent as Emily continued, her words carrying the weight of the movement behind her. She spoke about the importance of the reforms, about how they could prevent what had happened to her from happening to someone else. And most importantly, she spoke about hope. The hope for a future where everyone was treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their appearance. When she finished, the crowd erupted into applause. Emily stepped back from the podium, her heart pounding, knowing she had given everything she had. After hours of discussion and debate, the city council was ready to vote. Emily and her family sat in the audience, holding their breath as the council members began to cast their votes. The room was tense, with everyone on edge, waiting to see which way the decision would go. The first few votes were in favor of the reforms, and a wave of hope surged through the crowd. But then came a series of votes against the reforms, and Emily's heart sank. It was going to be close, too close to call. Finally, the last council member cast their vote. The room was silent as the mayor tallied the results. Emily gripped her mother's hand, her heart racing. "The motion to pass the police reforms has been approved," the mayor announced. The room erupted in cheers, and Emily felt a wave of relief wash over her. The reforms had passed. It wasn't the end of the fight, but it was a major victory, one that Emily and her community had worked tirelessly to achieve. As the crowd celebrated, Emily hugged her parents tightly, tears of joy streaming down her face. They had done it. They had made a difference. In the weeks following the vote, the town began to implement the reforms. The police department underwent new training, and the Community Oversight Board was established. There was still a long road ahead, but for the first time, real change felt possible. Emily returned to school, and things began to feel more normal again. Her grades started to improve, and her friendships, especially with Hannah, slowly mended. The weight of the past few months hadn't disappeared, but it felt lighter now. One afternoon, as Emily sat in the park with her parents watching the sunset, she reflected on everything that had happened. She had gone from being a scared 13-year-old girl, humiliated and confused by the actions of the police, to becoming a leader in a movement for justice. She had found her voice, and with it, she had helped change her community for the better. Laura and Michael sat beside her, smiling as they watched their daughter. "You've grown so much, Emily," Laura said softly. "We're so proud of you." Emily smiled, feeling a sense of peace. "I couldn't have done it without you." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the park, Emily knew that the fight for justice was far from over. But she also knew that she wasn't alone, and that together, with her family and community, they would continue to push for a better future. Months after the reforms were passed, Emily was invited to speak at a regional conference on social justice. The movement she had helped start had gained attention far beyond her town, and now she had the opportunity to inspire others. Standing on stage in front of hundreds of people, Emily felt the familiar nervousness in her stomach. But as she looked out at the crowd, she also felt a sense of pride. She had come so far, and now she had the chance to share her story with a new audience. When I was 13, something happened to me that changed my life, Emily began, her voice strong and steady. But what I've learned is that one voice, your voice, can make a difference. You don't have to be famous or powerful or older to stand up for what's right. You just have to be brave enough to speak up. The crowd listened intently as Emily shared her journey, her struggles, her victories, and the lessons she had learned along the way. By the time she finished, the room was filled with applause. As Emily left the stage, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She had turned her pain into power, and now she was helping others do the same. Walking out into the bright afternoon light, Emily smiled to herself. The road ahead would be filled with challenges, but she was ready for whatever came next. She had her family, her community, and most importantly, her voice. And with that, she knew she could face anything. As the months passed, life began to settle back into a new normal for Emily. The reforms were taking root in the community, and the police department was slowly beginning to change its ways. The town felt different, more open, more just. People were talking about issues they had once avoided, and Emily had become a symbol of hope and resilience for so many. One evening, Emily sat with her parents in their living room, reflecting on how far they had come. The journey had been long and difficult, but they had achieved so much together. "You've changed this town, Emily," Michael said, looking at his daughter with pride. "And who knows, maybe you'll change even more places in the future." Emily smiled, thinking about all the other communities that might be facing similar struggles. She knew that her journey wasn't over. There was still so much work to be done, but she was ready for whatever came next. Laura placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "You've inspired so many people, sweetheart. Don't ever forget that." Emily nodded, feeling a sense of peace wash over her. She had found her voice, and she had used it to create real, lasting change. That was something no one could ever take away from her. As she looked out the window at the fading sunset, Emily knew that her story wasn't just her own anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever faced injustice, everyone who had ever felt powerless. And together, they could keep moving forward, one step at a time. Hi, everyone. If you've been inspired by Emily's journey and believe in the power of standing up for what's right, we'd love for you to join us on this mission. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel to stay updated on more stories like this one. Your support helps us reach more people and spread messages of hope, justice, and change. Let's keep the conversation going. Together, we can make a difference. So hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications to never miss an update. And if you know someone who could benefit from hearing Emily's story, share this video with them. We can all be a part of the change. Thank you for being here with us. Let's continue this journey together. Click the subscribe button now, and we'll see you in the next video.